Hello, everyone, and welcome to Galactic Basics, a Star Wars tabletop role-playing game setting primer. I'm Todd Moonbounce here with Jawa. How you doing today, sir?
Good. How are you doing, Todd?
Doing well, thank you. Excited for episode 2. So last episode we kind of gave a overview of the themes in Star Wars and ideas you can use to just help with that aspect of your campaign. But as we said with this series, we really want to provide a basic foundation for any DMs out there when they go to choose their era, when they start creating their story and whatnot, that they don't have to go down the rabbit hole and the spiral that is all the content out there, because as we know, there's a lot of that.
hmm
So yeah, so today we chose the Old Republic era to go over first. We're gonna have a few videos on that specifically with different topics. And today we're going to look at the timeline. So basically, just go through that calendar, look at the major events, the major eras within that overarching era of the Old Republic, and hopefully this provides you with some ideas on areas where there's not a lot of content out there, so it's kind of a free-for-all for you as a DM to do what you want, and then also when there is events, how you can utilize those to help you guide your own campaign, things like that. So we know that basically there's a pre-Republic era as we get into this. Basically, dawn of time for Star Wars, up to about 25,000 BBY, and there's not a ton of information there, or at least content for a campaign. Jawa, tell us a little bit about the pre-Republic era, and if there's any use of that or what's important for that as we set this up.
Yeah. So, as you said, this is really there isn't really much content there for a campaign. But I figured it was worth mentioning because it's sort of the era where you have all those, your ancient precursor civilizations. Most notable being the Rakata, who were uh, essentially, an ancient empire, evil, of course, that conquered a lot of the galaxy, eventually fell. Um, there was also, these beings called celestials. They're Star Wars' closest equivalent to like gods that kind of like crafted the universe. And things like the Jedi sort of being founded in their earliest incarnations about like 36,000 years before the movies. Uh, there's some other things. There's a conqueror known as Zim the Despot who carves out a huge empire, massive war with the Hutts. And while these are not necessarily basis for a campaign, you could totally use these later. Like the Rakata, especially, are well known from the KOTOR game. They have ancient super weapons and powers. There's another one called the Qua, who have like hyper gates, teleport across the galaxy instantly. Um, or even say Zim the Despot, you could have like a long lost descendant of him seeking to reclaim his fallen empire, um, stuff like that. And yeah, it kind of nothing really occurs, and this kind of goes on really till about 12,000 years BBY, where in 20 ugh, 25,053 BBY the Republic is founded, and this is sort of the official beginning of the Old Republic. Uh, but again, not much happens. It's about 13,000 years. Uh, Lots of drives for colonization and expansion. There's first schism in the Jedi Order caused by Dark Jedi, and lots of internal and external conflicts within the Republic. Um, so this is sort of just the groundwork for the era.
Yeah, just kind of an empty, you know, uh, building phase, if you will. But there is not necessarily great for that Star Wars feel of a campaign, but certainly still an era that you could utilize that, right?
Yeah, totally. Um, it this is sort of an era where, as you said, it's not very Star Warsy. There's no Sith. I'm don't even know if there's lightsabers at this point. but it's going to be more akin to like say a medieval fantasy, but in space, if anything.
Nice, yeah. And that, I think that's maybe a good transition kind of into this next period here. Still a little bit with this you know, core time of the Old Republic, but the Pius Dia era, which is around 12,000 BBY to 11,000 BBY, if I'm doing um, the numbers correct there, going backwards with the timeline. But basically this, you know, um, this group or this religious body known as Pius Dia, who came and took control of the Republic, and took over, and there was just these crusades and whatnot. Reading through this is actually, again, not necessarily traditional Star Wars feel, but definitely a lot of opportunity for a cool campaign.
Yeah, so essentially, as he said, a religious body takes over the Republic, turns it very xenophobic, and then they initiate a series of crusades that last about 1,000 years, uh, particularly against any outlying alien cultures or species. And it's very much like a recession for the Republic's, very inclusive and generally just uh, again, yeah, inclusive is the best word. Very inclusive culture, and there's over 34 crusades that we know about that take place. So there's a lot of content, uh, and a lot of it is left vague, so you can use it, and it's especially great more for like running like a medieval campaign, sort of. Like it's heavily inspired by the real world medieval crusades, with like the Templars and all that kind of stuff. And even though it's sort of not Star Wars as you might think of it, it could be really cool for sort of getting that unique and flavorful campaign in a universe that otherwise is a bit more focused and a bit more advanced, I suppose. Um, but eventually, of course, this ends, and the Republic is sort of reformed back into itself, which sort of leads um, into an era of Reconstruction, which is about 11,000 BBY to about 7,000. And again, it kind of goes back to that like nothing really happening, and it's basically just Reconstruction and more expansion.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so again, going back to the Pius Dia era as well, and just tying in with our last episode of looking into these other areas of influence for your campaign. You mentioned the medieval era and whatnot. So if you're a DM out there that maybe just is really a fan of that or knows that well, I mean, this is where that there is some references within the Star Wars lore that you could go to and see how those things line up. So yeah, I think that's hopefully the point we definitely get across overall is, um, some of these eras will be better than others just because of what they offer, but certainly you can kind of take anything and run with it. So yeah, so we get past the Reconstruction there, and we really, I think we start getting into the meat and potatoes here. So after the Reconstruction era, which is, as you said, up to about 7,000 BBY, we get to the Mandaron period. And this runs 7,000 to 5,000 BBY, and probably going to be the most perceived true Old Republic era that most people would be familiar with. So tell us, I know there's a couple main events in here that are pretty significant, but tell us about as we get into this period here.
Yeah, so as Todd said, this is sort of like the birth of the Old Republic as most of us imagine it from the KOTOR games and the MMO and all that stuff. Um, and it's sort of the Sith are born in this period. There's massive wars between them and the Jedi. Uh, the Mandalorians are essentially created for the first time and kind of don their iconic armor, as well as a bunch of very more eldritch, strange, exotic aliens and anomalies occurring. But the two main events is one, the 100-Year Darkness, which is at 7,000 BBY. Essentially, there is a schism in the Jedi Order, which leads into this 100-year war where these dark Jedi create monstrous armies to battle the Jedi and the Republic, and they do lose the war, but they afterwards are essentially exiled and discover Korriban, which is known as the home of the Sith, and they found the Sith there. And then, sort of jumping ahead 2,000 years, this event isn't really one which you could really do anything with, but it is sort of a important note as it does impact the next few eras, and it is the birth of a Sith pureblood named Tenebrae in 5,103 BBY. He essentially, as a 10-year-old kid, goes on to kill his father, who is a Sith Lord named Dramath, conquers his homeworld all by himself, and then 3 years later, he is officially recognized as a Sith by Marco Ragnos, who at this time is the current Dark Lord of the Sith, and he gets the title of Lord Vitiate. And so, again, like the previous eras, this isn't necessarily super ripe with content for a campaign at the very least. Um, but if you did want to do this, there's obviously the 100-Year Darkness, which, whether you set it maybe closer to the beginning of the conflict or towards the end, there's definitely something you can do. Obviously, it's 100 years, so spanning that amount of time in a campaign is a bit hard. But one idea could maybe be either having some long-lived characters, or maybe starting out as like some weaker Padawans or whatever at the beginning, and then over the course of the campaign, maybe you switch characters, and by the end, you're playing some really cool Jedi Masters, or even Sith if you want to go that route.
Yeah, lots of opportunities there. I think that's a good one in this era, at least, to focus on. And as you said, find some species that have that long life, and maybe you were a child at the start of it, and then you grow in, and then you pick your starting point. Or, as you said, do different characters. Maybe it's a generational thing, and your grandfather fought in the beginning of it, and whatever. And so, but yeah, definitely a significant time period here, or events here that kind of lay things out a little bit going forward. So that leads us into, the next section is the post-Mandarin period, which is 5,000 to 4,000 BBY, and probably the first of the most well-known events for the Old Republic, that being the Great Hyperspace War.
Yeah, so the Great Hyperspace War is a short 1 year war that sparks after death of Marco Ragnos. It essentially causes a civil war within the Sith, resulting in one named Naga Sadao becoming the new Dark Lord. And then a short while later, some Republic hyperspace scouts, just exploring, trying to find new paths, they accidentally discover Korriban and the Sith. And Sadao essentially tricks his own people into believing that this is the precursor for the Republic invading them and coming to destroy them. And he uses that to unite them and launch essentially the first full scale galactic war between the Republic and the Sith, which is very iconic to the Old Republic era. It happens quite often. Um, and frankly, covering this war would be almost impossible. It's a 1 year time span, but so much happens in it. Just like the Clone Wars is only like 2 years, I think, but there's hundreds of hours of content between books, movies, TV shows.
Yeah.
Um, but this war essentially culminates in the Sith losing, as Sadao goes into exile and hiding, and the Republic begin like purging the Sith uh, to every extent. They are, whether they're civilians or actual Sith, they're just killing them all. It's probably one of the darkest things the Republic does. Um, and in the wake of that, previously mentioned Vitiate from the last era, he essentially calls any of the Sith that are surviving to his homeworld of Anathema, and he binds them to his will and conducts this powerful ritual of Sith magic known as the Ritual of Anathema. And it essentially strips the entire planet and everyone on it of the Force. It kills everyone except for Vitiate. He is made essentially immortal and just unbelievably powerful. Uh, and from there, he kind of tricks anyone surviving into believing that the Republic did that. And he takes these survivors, they go out into deep space, and he begins a lengthy exodus leading into him founding his own hidden Sith Empire, uh, which comes into play, I think, about 1,300 years later. So quite a quite a long time that he spends doing this. And other than that, really, there are a couple more minor events, including Naga Sadow and another schism in the Jedi Order, but they're very minor. And if you are interested, I encourage you looking into them, but they're not you know big enough to really get into.
Yeah. So yeah, I think lots here though. Otherwise, and like you said, I've seen lots of people use the Clone Wars for their campaign, and certainly an era that we'll likely cover down the road. But just as an example, as you said, there's so much here during this period as well that if you want to utilize that for your campaign, dig into that and see what's out there, and that creates a lot of good framework, and then you can kind of make your own, situations and whatnot there. So, um, and moving on though, we get into the, starting at about 4,000 BBY. Just short here, it's about 50 years to 3950. Is the old Sith Wars, and probably most of us are familiar with this, and this is where the Knights of the Old Republic game takes place in that story. So tell us or tell us about this and how to utilize that.
Yeah, so this era has more going on than just that, but obviously, the KOTOR games very much drown out most of the Old Republic because they're wonderful and they have amazing stories. But before that is an event known as the Krath Holy Crusade. It's sort of uh, a small Sith-based cult or a dark side cult takes over a planet deep within the core worlds, and they launch this crusade against the Republic. They eventually almost bring, Coruscant, the capital of the Republic, to defeat, but are betrayed by a Jedi who had fallen in the conflict named Ulic Queldroma. And this is also the first time that we ever see the Mandalorians involved on a galactic scale. They are sort of brought into this war as allies for the Krath. And this war has, again, quite a bit going on. Too much to delve into, but it does include a number of notable characters. Again, there's Ulic Queldroma. He's quite well known to the Old Republic. There's also Mandalore the Indomitable, sort of the first true Mandalorian warlord. And probably the most well-known character in this era would be Exar Kun, who is often one of the most talked about Sith lords from the Old Republic, um, among many others, of course. And there is also other things going on, such as a Freedom Nad uprising, it's known as, and it's tied to Naga Sadow. So it's like this whole like sort of 5,000 year period is very intertwined. Um, but eventually, following that, comes Mandalore the Ultimate, who succeeds uh, Mandalore the Indomitable, who died at the end of the last crusade I just mentioned. He's influenced by Vitiate agents out in, wherever they're hiding, into waging the Mandalorian Wars using his Mandalorian Neo Crusaders. This is one of the more famous wars in Star Wars because it's the direct precursor to the first KOTOR game, and in turn, eventually the second. This is where Revan uh, claims and dons his iconic mask, which he takes from a Mandalorian. He leads tons of rogue Jedi and the Republic military into the war, and he ultimately becomes a legend in the galaxy when he kills Mandalore the Ultimate in one-on-one combat, and he brings the Republic to victory. And then after this war, it leads into the first KOTOR game, sort of. Jumping ahead a bit, sorry. Uh, First, Revan and his apprentice, Malik, they seek out the Sith Emperor, but they're turned to the dark side, as we know. They managed to break free of the Emperor's control, but they've already discovered the Starforge, which is an ancient Rakatan superweapon, which essentially just builds infinite fleets of ships. Uh, they create their own Sith Empire and begin Jedi Civil War, and with that, the events of the first KOTOR game. I'm not going to delve into that much, or the following Jedi Purge, which is following Revan's redemption, uh, and sort of a group of Sith warlords loyal to them purging the Jedi, because those are those are all outlined in the games, and there's just so many resources, from YouTube to wikis to books. There's even the old Star Wars D20 from Wizards of the Coast. They made a KOTOR setting guide, which outlines a lot of the stuff we've talked about today. And so, yeah, you could do so much here,
Yeah,
like with the,
lots of resources out there for sure for this period.
yeah, like I think you, Todd, right? You're in a campaign right now,
Yeah.
somewhere in this period.
Yeah, so we're doing one. So it's the hunted campaign that Tegan, who is on the podcast with me. He does. He's the DM of that, and it's set in between the KOTOR games 1 and 2. So he's picked that area, that time period, and it's still something. It's still a very new era to me. So I couldn't tell you where things are lining up or whatnot. I know, so I guess I can say that I've looked into it enough that, my character, Jedi Guardian, he was with the Revankists, and, when they split off to go to, whatever, the Sith Empire or whatever they call themselves, my character, didn't go along with them, was against that. So that's kind of his story and figuring that out. So, but yeah, I think it'll be a cool era to use. And just as a personal example there too, is that whether you are the DM or whatever, even if you're a player, we hope these videos also help players out there. Is that like myself, at first I was like, man, I don't know anything about this era, and I took the time and looked into it, and it helped create this backstory, and it's been a lot of fun now learning all this information about it, and then bringing that into my character and things like that. So yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, and actually, sort of what you said with your character and the Revanchists, uh, one of the ideas I had was, you could run a campaign that lasts most of these events. It could start with the Mandalorian Wars, maybe your Jedi or warriors in it, and then you're following Revan and you're loyal, and then eventually that war's over, and then the Jedi Civil War begins, and Revan's now the enemy. That's a lot of inner conflict and a lot
Yeah.
players and DMs could do. And again, even if that ends, you can lead that into the Jedi getting purged. And if you're a Jedi, that's a pretty big deal. So there's so much you could do with it, and that's just one example of endless, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of opportunity there. And again, we're not. It would take multiple videos probably to go over all that stuff. So hopefully we're just laying a good groundwork for you guys out there as you get to your campaign. Anything else on that period before we jump ahead, Jawa?
No, I think that's at least for the
For now,
for,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So moving on. So around 3950 to about 2000 BBY. This is going to be following events of the second KOTOR game, and we have the Inter-Sith Wars that begin. And we might have touched on it a little bit, kind of talking about previous. But tell us what's going on here in this era.
Yeah, so at this point, this sort of begins right after KOTOR 2 ends, and essentially Revan and Mitra Surik, who is the protagonist in KOTOR 2, they essentially venture out to find the Sith Emperor. Revan's recollecting his memories, and they're going out to try and find and defeat him. It doesn't work out. Spoilers. She dies, and Revan is captured. But this sort of leads into the era truly beginning around 300 years after this, when this Sith Emperor, he essentially has, over 1300 years built up a massive massive hidden empire, and all military focused. And he launches an invasion in 3681 BBY, which is starts with them reclaiming Korriban after 1300 years, and they just launch a devastating onslaught. It's very much akin to like the Blitzkrieg in the Second World War. But this war doesn't go as well for them. Things go wrong, and it essentially results in 3 decades of war. And it turns into a bit of a stalemate towards the end. And it only ends when the Sith manage to trick some Jedi and Republic leaders who are very desperate at this point into meeting for a peace deal on a well-known planet, which at this point is neutral, known as Alderaan. Um, During this peace talk, the Sith send a massive fleet to Coruscant, and they essentially just ravage the planet, destroy the Jedi Temple, and force a surrender. And this ends this 30-year conflict known as the Great Galactic War. And it leads into the Cold War beginning from the event known as the Treaty of Coruscant. And this is sort of an 11-year period, which is very much based on the real world Cold War. It's essentially only a ceasefire of open hostilities, but there's still tons of subterfuge, assassination, and like proxy conflicts. Like Republic and Sith are warring, but they're doing it through, minor organizations or planets. And this eventually ends and leads into what is known as the Galactic War in 3643 BBY. And sort of that's where the events of the SWTOR, the Old Republic MMO, begins. And and just that, I summarize that as much as I can, but this is a truly massive era, and frankly, it's even much larger than all the KOTOR eras, and that has like 5 or 6 events, whereas this only really has 3. And it's because the MMO has so much content and tie-in novels and comics and like 500-page encyclopedias. But it essentially can be broken down into those 3 events: the Great Galactic War, the Cold War, the Galactic War. And yeah, it's just there is so much going on here, and I personally love it. I think this is one of, if not the best eras to run a Star Wars campaign if you want, the option to do whatever. Like players,
despite all the established content and whatever, they're still just so expansive that you still can, pretty much do, whatever you want, right?
yeah, like I personally have run 3 campaigns in this era. All of my Star Wars campaigns have been in this. The first one, they were basically, just a motley crew who end up meeting in a cantina, very A New Hope like. Then they end up crash landing on a planet known as Ord Mantell. And this is one of those planets embroiled in those proxy conflicts I mentioned. Essentially, the Republic's backing the official government, and secretly the Sith are backing like a separatist movement, rebellion. And so, I sort of played out a bit of this civil war, and the players were all involved in that. And then right when they've kind of mostly dealt with it and are about to leave the planet, I had, them sort of hear noises and whatnot, and looking up in the sky, there was just essentially a fleet of Star Destroyers there. And it was a really cool moment, but, that, as a matter of fact, never exists in the lore.
Yeah.
But getting caught up in what does exist can really hinder you, and nothing said it didn't exist. And even if it did, it was a cool moment that you can change.
Yeah, I think that's that's hopefully that's the goal here. And I think when you're going to plan your campaign, whatever era you're using, utilize up, like, pick a start date on your campaign and utilize everything up to that point, and then know that from there, whatever happens. Use the events that in the in the lore, use those events that do happen as a guideline to help influence. Like, in yours, the reason that you had that fleet show up is because of these other things going on. but you that also didn't actually happen, and again it influenced that decision and that storyline, whatever. So that's hopefully the biggest takeaway for everyone is when they're looking up and researching this information.
Yeah, and as he said, creative liberties are very important to take. Um, but and as I said, that's just one example. That was a very more like classic Star Wars adventure, whereas I later ran a bounty hunter campaign in this era after the Second War began. The players could not have cared less about the war going on. It was just a
Right.
backdrop, but to them it was like, hey, war profiteering, that's more money for us. And then now the current game I'm running is more a bit back to that band of misfits, but it's set only 5 months after this treaty is signed. So the galaxy's known war for 28 years, nothing else. And I don't think any of my characters were born before that, so they've literally only known war. And so a huge focus is them sort of adjusting to the galaxy, and the galaxy itself adjusting to a post-war period. And
Yeah.
so there's so much you can do here, and especially in that sort of Cold War period, regardless of where you set it, you can really do anything, and it's a wonderful era if you want that, as opposed to more focused stuff like say the Clone Wars or the
Hmm.
original trilogy. Like those are very focused. If you
Yep.
pick Rebels, you're on the run, whereas this is just whatever you want.
Yeah, right. I think the key word you said there that I love is the backdrop. In your second campaign is you have these things going on, you utilize this information in the era of saying, all right, this is what's going on in the world, used as much or as little as you want, but that is the backdrop of the story. Throw your characters into it if you want. But yeah, I think that's the perfect way to kind of to mention that. So yeah. So, without kind of beating that era to death here, there's maybe one little chunk left here to touch on, and it's kind of leading up into, where the Old Republic, maybe ends or whatever, whether there's a true official end of it, but it's about 3,600 to 1,000 BBY. That wraps things up. Most of us would probably know about Darth Bane and his story and where that comes from, and then we get into the Rule of Two, and I think you mentioned Jawa in one of the movies. It does, someone mentions about 1,000 years since the Sith or whatever,
Hmm.
like that. So that's kind of yeah. So anything else to touch on with this, kind of closing period of the Old Republic?
Yeah, I mean, Todd mostly summed it up. There is still stuff going on, and even in 3630, the MMO is still progressing as it is. Like I think that's the current year it's in. But sort of looking over all of it, this era is much smaller, and it's frankly the end of the Old Republic as most of us will imagine it. As he said, it's more like getting into the movie era. So there is I forget what the called off the top of my head, but it involves the planet Ruson and essentially big final war between the Jedi and Sith lasting a few years, and it results in the Sith basically not existing anymore, and the galaxy thinks they're gone.
Hmm.
So that that's a very nuanced topic, dealing with like the Bane trilogy and whatnot, and I felt that it kind of gets away from the core of the Old Republic.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely an event to be aware of. It's something that when you're looking at the time periods and whatnot, at least hit the wiki page on on those events, because if you want to split off and do whatever around that time period, of course that's fine, but know that that's a key event and things drastically change for the Sith and whatnot afterwards. So that's definitely good to keep in mind kind of leading up to that. But because then of course too, if you got players that want to be certain class types and things, some of those things could affect that. But yeah, so I think that's everything. Lots there in this time period, as you said, Jawa. There's I think the original intentions behind Star Wars 5e was to be utilized in this time period. Of course, too, because you have all these different classes. So obviously, during the Rise of the Empire and Rebellion era, you don't really have many known Jedi, so that's a challenge. And then whatever, so just whatever you're going with. So this Old Republic era really is vast enough to allow you. And then we talked about the pockets of time where there might not be information that is perfect for you to just drop in and do what you want. And you don't have to worry too much about stepping on toes of lore and things like that.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I just wanted to put emphasis on what you said. The pockets of time. This essentially everything we discussed today. I believe if you actually looked at the dates, runs from about 100,000 BBY to 1,000. That's a long time.
Yeah.
There is so much empty time, and even just like in these eras, themselves, like even within the Cold War, particularly, harkening back to that, like I've done a lot of research into it, and like between about there's like a 7-year period, like nothing happened. At least nothing that's like written down. Like all we know is like Sith are, doing their thing, Republic's doing their thing, Jedi are rebuilding, but like there's no details on events, and so you can pick these pockets of time and do completely wild things. You've seen how many fallen empires and how many times the Sith rise and fall. Like you could totally pick a time period and just have your own Sith Empire or whatever going on.
Yeah, it could easily last a few years. It doesn't have to be extensive. So yeah, I know kind of getting ready for this episode, I looked at the timeline that I think there's one on the Wikipedia and whatnot. And it's just a list. It's just and they've got so many entries, and so yeah, you could go in there and say, all right, I want to look at this, and always go to those resources and look that stuff up to kind of continue your research. But of course, hopefully, as we said, the goal here is to give you a basic foundation of the information, so you're not overwhelmed when you go to begin to do that research. Because I know, I've done that myself, and it's nice to have that laid out. So
yeah, it can be daunting, but the timeline he mentioned, it's an amazing resource, and something I think worth is mentioning. Each of these time periods that we mentioned, and then there's tons more that we glossed over. You can click those, and then those will open an even further expanded timeline just on that. And then if you ever click on, like, say, the link for the Jedi Civil War, a useful tip that I learned in my research is if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you will see two main things. Sorry. One is sources, and the others is appearances, and that shows sources where information comes from and where it actually appears in. So there's like that's just like another rabbit hole to go down.
Yep, I use that all the time. In my campaigns, because I'm running some modules right now, and I want to see where this stuff comes from, and that's that definitely leads me on spin-off things here and there. So definitely a good tip for sure. So yeah, but so hopefully this episode on the timeline was helpful for you guys. We're gonna keep going with the Old Republic. There's lots of stuff to cover here, and next up in a couple weeks we're gonna look at kind of the core factions, the core groups of the Old Republic. We'll focus in on that Star Wars: The Old Republic, like the MMO period there, just for consistency. I mean, of course, these groups, as Jawa has said throughout today's episode, that we've had a lot of that up and down with the groups, and the Sith especially rise and fall. So things have changed. So we're going to just look at that SWTOR era specifically, to give you a good idea. Looking at obviously the Jedi, the Sith, the Republic, the the Hutts, and those things, so that if you're placing a campaign in that era, the basics of what factions and groups exist, and then you're at least aware of them. That's, I think, the minimum, is you're aware of them, and then you can utilize them if you need to. So that will be next time on Galactic Basics. We hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. And this is, of course, you're watching this on YouTube. We will have this on our podcast channel for those that like the audio version. And we're doing this bi-weekly. Of course, look up all the Dungeon Jedi Masters content at dungeonjedimasters.com. You can listen to our regular podcast. We have stuff on Instagram. We're posting NPCs and custom items and plot hooks, things there. Of course, our Twitch channels where we do live plays. And then if you'd like to support what we do, help us keep that podcast up and other things like that. We do have our Patreon, so check that out as well. Jawa, always a pleasure. This has been great little new project for us, so thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been really fun to sort of dive back into all this nerdy lore stuff.
Absolutely, it's fun. It's fun for me too, as someone who myself is new to this a little bit, this era. So it's been great. But yeah. So everyone, thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time. May the Force be with you.
May the Force be with you.